welcome to Reaction Arm. I'm Michael McConkey, and this is your source for biology and culture and politics. And today I'm joined, as you can see, by Patricia. Say hello, Patricia.
Hi, Michael.
And Charles down there at the bottom. Hello,
Hey,
Charles.
how's it going? From my point of view, I'm in the top left. I don't know about you.
Oh, that's interesting. So, Patricia, where is Charles on your computer? Patricia's recording this, so where is he?
Bottom.
He's on the bottom. Okay, so I was right. So there's a few things to mention as we start this show. First is that the show is now available as a podcast registered. It's been available as a podcast for a while, but now it's actually indexed with iTunes. So if you want to listen to us driving to work, or when in the gym working out or whatever, you can do that now. And as you can see by looking at the screen, we're actually experimenting with a new technology, trying to raise our game in terms of our technical production. So bit of an experiment. So we'll see how all that goes. So today's show, we're going to call something along the lines of political anger. And we're interested in getting to how or what is going on in politics today. People seem to be extremely angry all the time. Certainly our friends to the south in the States, there seems to be tremendous political anger, seems to have been exacerbated since the election of Donald Trump, though maybe that's not true. Maybe we'll have some things to say about that to suggest that's not as true as it might appear. In other places in the world, there's this, certainly in the West and Europe, this seems to be a real issue. So I guess we wanted to discuss today what's going on, not just in the political context, but what's the story of anger? Why do people get angry? And what's the evolutionary foundation or purpose of anger, assuming that it must have one? So any opening remarks by either of you to get us started? Patricia, why don't we start with you? Any thoughts you have to get us started on this topic?
Anger. It functions to help you get what you want. Episode over. We're done. Just joking, but no. We'll get into it more. But yeah, I think that's pretty much what it boils down to, right?
Okay. All right. So this show is over. So let's. All right. So Charles, do you have any thoughts?
I think what Trish said is a good, like, too long didn't read, or I guess too long didn't watch. That anger can help you get what you want at times, or like renegotiate a situation, right? To kind of like improve things somewhat. It's not necessarily to get you fully what you want, but sometimes it makes better. Sometimes it doesn't, right? Like, if you think about a situation where maybe somebody's being treated unfairly, and the person being treated unfairly gets angry, and the person who was treating them unfairly is much, much more powerful and just crushes them. Well, you didn't get what you want. You got crushed. But it can be a tool to help you get what you want. Just not necessarily the case.
Just not. It's just yeah. There's no guarantee in any of these evolved dispositions, emotional or otherwise, right? They're successful because on the margins they more often work than they don't.
But they just have to work enough to propagate that behavior to the next generation.
Yeah, and they don't. Yeah, they just have to work often enough to be successful. They don't have to work all the time, and you wouldn't expect that to be the case.
Yeah.
So do we want to talk? So for the first question is, I mean, this is, before we go into anger itself, I mean, it is my impression that things are getting a little insane in terms of the anger people feel around politics these days.
So I'm guessing you're talking about like U.S. politics right now. The thing is, I wonder how much that's true, and it could be true, right? But things, for example, like technology is a bit different, right? Like, think like 20 years ago or whatever, 30 years ago, like when you became aware of events, they often tend to be much, much more local. Where today, not only does internet exist, and it's existed for a while, but it's very popular, but things like Twitter or Facebook might spread information very, very quickly. You have YouTube, you have other things. And this has maybe changed how information flows across the world, and true information, but also fake information, whether it's non-institutionalized, just people spreading it, or institutionalized in form of marketing or propaganda, which are really just the same thing, just marketing being what business calls propaganda, and propaganda what you call government who does marketing. But anyways, maybe it's just perception. And if you think now, there's a lot of, from some people, not everyone certainly, but from some people, they have a very negative reaction towards Trump, for example, right? President Trump. And I remember before there was very negative reactions towards President Obama and President Bush the Jr. and even President Bush the Senior, and even Bill Clinton. Like, remember when Bill Clinton was involved, not him personally, but like his regime was involved in the warring and the bombing of places within the Balkans, and there was a lot of outrage towards that at the time. Sorry?
We called it an administration, not a regime.
Sure.
Though you might be giving something away there. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, either way. The Clinton administration, this is Bill Clinton, not Hillary Clinton, in case people are younger. So Bill Clinton, Hillary's husband, was president at one point, and he was involved in a lot of wars within the Balkans, right? And there was different messaging and propagandas and ways that people felt about people as a result of this, but there was a lot of negative reactions to that. And like each president of the United States seems to attract negative reactions, sometimes from the same people from administration, sometimes from different people who shift back and forth.
So
hang on, just let me make one more point. One example might be this. I remember during the Bush era, there were people on the left and also libertarians who were involved in the anti-war movement. And then when President Obama got elected, most of the people on the left seemed to leave, and the libertarians were left. And they stayed as a part of anti-war movement, and then conservatives, people on the right moved in, and the anti-war movement morphed into the Tea Party, right? And there was still, like, you had people who had negative reactions to the standing president of the United States. It's just that people changed. I mean, some of them stayed the same. The libertarians stayed throughout, but like the left, went away from the movement, and then the right came in, which was kind of interesting.
So sorry, is your assessment that, so Michael's original premise was sort of, it seems like there's more political anger, and was your assessment that there is or there isn't, it just maybe looks like there is because we have new news outlets, just like a one sentence?
So I'm saying it's not clear to me that it actually is. Like, maybe it's just the way, because we have different ways of information sharing on the internet, so, whether it be YouTube or Twitter or Facebook or whatever, things are just spreading differently, and it might seem like there's more violence and anger when it's really hasn't changed much. But I don't know. I'm just saying, like, it's not obvious to me that it is.
So I went through a whole bunch of articles, this morning in preparation for this, and naturally I can't find what I'm looking for. But anyways, one of these articles, right? It's like, what it's better just to read one article and just try to remember it rather than you go through half a dozen and not find anything you want. But one of them, and I can't find now which one it was, actually had data from public opinion surveys, and they went back to 2008 or something, or even they might have gone back to 2001 actually. And they say there's clearly, in terms of self-reporting, right? People report being much more angry now. That people, didn't feel people didn't feel angry about those whom they disagreed with politically in the past. And it's fairly significant, 2 to 3 times it's jumped in terms of to which people report this. Now, of course, that doesn't answer the question of why. And I think that your point about social media and the amplification of this stuff is part of that, is part of why in fact that's changed. I don't know if it's the only reason, but it's it's probably part of the reason. But anyway, so let's just say that there's enough anger out there that we're struck by. I think your point about maybe we should address this, because I think you're right that undoubtedly people have all the other side's always upset about when their opposition is in power, but I don't remember people being angry about, but like, let's say it's the same people more or less, right, who were against Bush that are against Trump. It's not exactly the same, obviously, but let's say it's roughly the same. And I remember the protests, and I remember I went out with a woman who had a picture of Bush made to look like Adolf Hitler, and there was this, all this sort of stuff existed around Bush, but I don't remember people being as angry about it as they seem to be angry about Trump. And at least I don't. That's effect of social media. I don't know if there's something about Trump's personality that brings that out, which could easily be part of the explanation. But I certainly see a vastly escalated level of anger compared to just disapproval as I saw with Bush. But I don't know. That's just a personal observation for what it's worth.
Yeah. I haven't been to the U.S. to really see the protests myself, but what I've seen has been on YouTube. Yeah. I do know, for example, okay, so someone I grew up with, his father ran a union, and I remember one complaint they had about the media was that they could turn 4 people standing outside into a raging crowd if you just do the right camera angle, right? And there was a way of kind of misrepresenting what you saw. And I don't know if that's the case with what we're seeing on YouTube or Twitter or whatnot. But I wonder, right? Like, and for example, like there are people who go into these things. There's actually one guy I watch on YouTube. His name is Tim Pool. He has actually, I think he has 3 channels, like Timcast News, and like Subverse. But anyways, like he seems to go out, and he used to like just live stream like protests and stuff like that. And some of them were sizable, but some of them were like, it just looked like, okay, there's like 10 people over here, 5 people over here. It's like, okay, yay, protest, right? And when I first started like paying attention to him, for example, like I was actually kind of curious about protests in general. So when I heard of them happening, around where we live in Vancouver, I would go out to some of these, right? And I would see them, and like they were tiny. They were really, really tiny. There was like a small group of very, very loud people who just went and protest. I was like, okay. And sometimes maybe politicians seem to use this as an excuse to do something, but they weren't always substantial. It wasn't a situation where there's like people raging. The only one I've seen that's big, and I know this because they like march in front of my place regularly and they're pretty loud, is the anti-pipeline people. I can't remember the name of the pipeline or what they're going for, but it's like, I think even this morning I heard people screaming something as I was getting up, but yeah.
But of course, size or loudness, whatever, isn't necessarily doesn't necessarily track to anger, right? I mean, that's what strikes me is the emotional distraughtness. Like if you see all those videos that individual celebrities and non-celebrities made after the election of Trump, and they're tearing their hair out, and the world's going to end, and all this sort of craziness. That's more the kind of thing that I'm thinking of, and I don't recall seeing that kind of thing before. Now I admit, social media plays a role both in amplifying it and in making it more visible than it would have been, say, back when Bush was in power, because you didn't really have the same access.
I think I remember seeing some celebrities, some actors, actresses, I think an actress actually, but that were saying that if Bush Jr. got elected, that they would move out of the US. Now that person didn't, but I think I remembered even from that era. I don't remember actors and actresses saying that with President Obama, for example. I do know there was a lot of, there was hate.
Obviously not.
There was hate directed towards him. It just didn't seem to come from.
Not from actors and actresses.
Yeah, not from actors and actresses.
No. No, I mean, for sure. But again, I think we got to be careful not to mix these things up, because I can go back to when Reagan was elected, right? I remember when Reagan was elected, people, it's going to ruin the country, and it's, and all this sort of thing, right? And people saying they moved if he was elected and all this sort of, but I mean, that you didn't have this sort of shrillness that we now have. And it seems to me that there is a shrillness, but I guess we don't have any empirical data for it, right? I mean, we do have some. I mean, like I said, in terms of self-reporting, there is work that shows that people do feel more angry. but beyond that, I guess we're just going on our impressions here.
Yeah.
Well, look, I guess before we can make any more sense out of the political context, and I think let's for the sake of discussion, because otherwise we don't really have a show, let's assume that we're right, that there is in fact increased political anger, and let's see if we can make sense of what's going on there, why it's happening. So we had said earlier, in fact, Patricia sort of almost preempted the show there by suggesting that in fact we could explain it all just in terms of benefits coming from the exhibit of anger as a way to achieve benefits. So does somebody want to take on trying to explaining the evolutionary context?
I can take a small shot at it, and
okay,
then
you start us off, and then we can
take us over. So my understanding of anger is it's a little bit different than how we would talk about a lot of other emotions. Like it's totally different than hatred. It's different than revenge. It's different than moral outrage, and it may turn into that at some point. But one of the interesting things I think we have to remember about anger is that when somebody, let's say, like gives into you, or you feel like they have heard your complaint, anger dissipates very quickly. So it seems to be a tool in sort of interpersonal relationships. And so I think that if we're going to look at the, like the evolutionary state that anger evolved in, this would be something as a way to work out interpersonal conflict.
It sounds almost like negative reinforcements. Like if you think in terms of positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, like positive reinforcement, oh, you did something great, here's an encouragement, do more of that. Negative reinforcement, oh, you did something bad, stop doing that.
It could be kind of. And I think that the other thing that's probably important to remember, sorry, I just lost my point. I had another thing that I was going to say, and then I totally just sort of blanked on it in a minute. Never mind, come back to me.
Okay, well, let's. I'll flesh this out a bit with the work of Aaron Sell, who's done a lot of research and written a lot about the evolution of anger, and his suggestion, and this is sort of a summary of a lot of empirical work, is that we have kind of a mechanism built, and so we know we have all these different kinds of mechanisms that read cues from the environment and generate appropriate behavior. And he suggests there's something like this that he calls the welfare trade-off ratio. I almost couldn't remember what it was there for a second. The welfare trade-off ratio. And basically what this is that as we're dealing with other people. Okay, actually, let's just take a step back and put this in a context, right? The important context for this, of course, is that we're a social species. And we get all kinds of tremendous benefits by dealing with other people in the social context. We get safety in numbers. We get benefits of specialization, division of labor, comparative advantage. All kinds of benefits come by cooperating with people who don't actually have don't share genetic interests with us, but they share sort of beneficial interests, and so we can through positive sum gains interaction with each other, we can create benefits for each other, even though we're all acting out of our own genetic interest. So in this context, it's important that we be reasonably well regarded by other people. If we're poorly regarded, then we may lose out on opportunities to have coalition partners, to have friendships, or even to find the mates that we want to get. So to the degree that in the social context, other people disrespect us, this is a threat to our ability to be able to engage in these kind of relationships that provide the fitness benefits to us of access to resources or access to mates, as the case may be. And so we seem to evolve this welfare trade-off ratio mechanism that serves to recognize when someone is not giving us the respect that we're due, with the result being that our reputation can be damaged, and as a consequence, we can lose out on these social relationships of all the benefits that come to them. So it seems as though has evolved as a way of responding to situations where we've been disrespected. And I'll just say one more thing about that before I open up to you guys onto that, is that Sell also makes a point of distinguishing three different levels of anger. Because part of the point here is that anger is it's effective. It can be effective in terms of correcting these acts of disrespect, but it can be dangerous because it can escalate into a situation that becomes violent and then actually create costs for the person who's trying to correct the disrespect. So you want to be sure that that your response is appropriate. So the first stage is simply an information gathering stage. So you feel angry, you feel upset, but you're not sure if you really should be. So you sort of explore a little bit, like, the person really mean that? Do they really mean to put me down in that way or to disrespect me in that way? And then the second stage, I think, is where it's, if I remember correctly, it's where you've got the information, the person meant it, they're not withdrawing it, and so you become angry and you start sort of raising the stakes in terms of the potential outcome of the conflict. And the last, if I remember correctly, the last stage is where you haven't gotten any kind of satisfaction, and therefore you take some kind of action. Now, violence is one possibility, though it's actually relatively rare, it turns out, but some other kind of punitive action that imposes costs on other people, so that they're suffering some loss of benefits equal to yours, so that you're sort of improving your negotiating position. So the whole idea here is just last thought, Charles. So the whole idea here then is that the anger is a way of creating an impression that things could become increasingly aggressive and nasty, and that is supposed to raise your negotiating position in terms of getting back the respect that you feel you deserve and that you actually need to be able to engage in these beneficial social relationships.
Do you remember? Do you remember if he goes into what he means exactly by disrespect?
I don't remember if he defines disrespect, but from looking at his work, I think there's a functional definition that anything that would cause you to lose face in relationship to other people would, I think, qualify as being disrespect. So that's sort of a functional definition, but I don't remember if he spells it out precisely or not.
Okay.
There's a lot of papers, right? There's published a lot on this, so I haven't been, I haven't even read them all, and I certainly can't recall them all right now. So.
Yeah. I don't expect. I'm just curious if you remembered, because like when I hear disrespect, I think in terms of social status, and humans seem to have two systems of social status: dominant status, I'll punch you, I'll kick you, I'll kill you, I'll fire you from your job, or prestige status, where you kind of like get attracted to people who other people pay attention to or have some other quality, right? And it sounds like it's almost like a mix of those two. Like you're somehow moving down on the pecking order somehow, and it's a reaction to that. And I think to me at least that makes some sense. It doesn't mean it's true just because it makes sense to me, but it seems to make some sense. I remember reading something before about, for example, like I think it was rage was related to shame, but it seemed to be like affected by, say, something happened that caused your social status to lower, right? Like say someone's trying to dominate you in some way, you would feel a kind of shame, and as a reaction to that, you would feel a kind of rage, a kind of anger, right? And that could, result in like all sorts of different situations. Like maybe you're in a situation where you can't take it and you just have to subordinate, right? Or maybe you're in a situation where you do have options and you can change things, right? So at least it seems consistent with stuff I read on that. Although, like, I didn't know we were going to talk about this, so I didn't really go back and read any of that stuff. But yeah.
Can I just also jump into that? I think that it's not necessarily limited to how other people see you from the outside. I think that part of like the welfare trade-off ratio too is also just how you feel the other person is valuing your welfare. So like if you feel like the other party just is not sort of like thinking about your welfare or respecting your welfare, then it can be like an internal, just between your relationship to, in addition to sort of how you're viewed externally.
You know,
Okay.
I think that that's an accurate description of the function, but I'm not sure that it's a sufficient description of the evolutionary pressures. Because I mean, if it was only personal, I don't think that there would be evolutionary pressures to privilege that as a response, right? Because I mean, if someone is, if you can imagine if someone is just disrespecting you at a personal level, and you somehow, I mean, we're talking selfish gene sort of thing, as though as though we're making a conscious decision, right? If I'm a selfish gene designing a human being, I'm not going to be too concerned about my organism that I'm in being disrespected if no one else knows about the fact that they're being disrespected, right? I'm going to be much more concerned about them being disrespected if other people might see that disrespect, and it's going to have a consequence on my organism's ability to be able to mate or form coalitions or gain access to resources. So I'm sure that happens at that level, but I think the evolutionary pressures probably are social pressures.
I mean, perhaps it could be if your like wife is always angry at you because you don't feel like she's getting
right.
your husband has his like welfare in mind. I guess I'm thinking it like sort of in like a very like an interpersonal relationship, like a marriage.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah, no, good point. That's true. That's true. That can be in certain kinds of relationships. Disrespect itself can be indicator of loss of benefits of some kind. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Right, because I think that there might be a little bit of a different. I mean, I'm just sort of going off the cuff now. I actually hadn't considered this. Is like in that the type of anger that you would get, like between men and women versus men dealing with other men. That I feel like that there would be a difference. Like women would be, all right, I'm gonna draw in broad strokes. Nobody freak out.
Oh, they'll freak out.
Evolutionarily, because the cost of childbirth and rearing children was so great that you would be concerned about how you perceive your, sexual partner sort of values your welfare.
Yeah.
That's
yeah, and actually, since you bring up the question of men and women and anger, maybe another point worth bringing in here too, because I think it ties into the whole thing of anger, is that Sell has also done work around the ability. So what he's discovered, so he I think he did a few of these things, but one of them was that he found men with like a range of different upper body strength. The idea is more upper body strength, the more formidable you are as a physical threat, right? So he recorded the voices of men with a range of different upper body strength. And it turned out, and I don't remember if it was men, but I'm quite sure that it was both women and children, were able to recognize through the voice which men had the greater upper body strength.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it turns out that that this formidableness, the threat of violence, or the danger, let's say, of violence, is important for negotiating these kind of things. I think there's also research that shows that men with large upper body strength tend to feel more entitled politically, right? They tend to feel stronger about their political views and feel that their political views should be taken more seriously. And all this, I think, ties into a number of physiological things. So we know that, also when men, and I don't know about women if this is true or not, but I know in the case of men, that if they get into a confrontation, they will do things. And this is like typical of the animal world, but humans do this too. They'll sort of try and stand up taller, and they'll take breath in to sort of puff up their chest to make them appear to be more physically formidable, right? I mean, no, I don't think that people aren't thinking about this when they do it, but I mean, it's just an unconscious thing. And it seems as though anger is probably serving the same kind of function. The sort of face that males get when they're people, I mean, the research I know is done on males, I don't know females, gives a face that gives indication of strength, and it's a face that resembles the face that people have when they actually are aggressive and prone to violence. So it appears as though anger, at least in part, is this ability this attempt rather to make us appear more formidable and more threatening in a situation. Even though, and I think I said this earlier, even though Sal claims that actually, very rarely do these anger situations actually result in violence, it seems as though anger is at least partially evolved to give the appearance of the threat of violence to improve one's negotiating
How
situation.
how many different cultures do you study this in, and what ages? Like,
Yeah, it's pretty limited. Yeah, it's pretty limited. It's pretty limited. I
yeah,
can't remember exactly, but I mean, there's a bunch of different studies, right? There's, there's a bunch
yeah,
of, but I mean, there, it's often always with this kind of research. It's always challenging, right? It's not like doing statistical research, right? I mean, you're doing with actual subjects and actual context, and these are really expensive to do, right? So,
yeah.
I
No,
mean, you are working with fairly small sample sizes.
yeah. There's a reason why a lot of studies study first year university students. It's because it's easy. You're in university, you got to do a study.
I
You
think
just
that
go
this
to a
is
bunch of
mostly the
classes.
cell stuff is often like anthropological, I think, right?
He does bring a lot of anthropological evidence in, yeah.
But I just wanted to touch on one thing that you said that I think is like is a really important point. Is I think that being angry, the emotional reaction sort of makes your threats more credible. If you were to logically think, what would be sort of like a tit for tat, if I feel like somebody disrespected me, I would respond in kind. But when you get angry, I think the idea is that there's a possibility you could, out of, sort of emotional anger, respond in magnitude sort of greater than the situation would deem. So I think that, like, yeah, part of anger is like the idea of a credible threat that is not just like a completely sort of rational, sort of thought out response, if that makes sense.
No,
Yeah, it gives the impression of the danger of escalation, and that's why when two people, especially like two physically formidable males, are getting angry at each other, you get this really magnified escalation, right? Because they're both sort of playing the same game, and it just keeps ratcheting up, right?
Yeah, it doesn't feel like a game though when you're doing it's game in the game theory sense, not
Yeah, that's what I mean.
not
Yeah.
like we're just pretending.
No, certainly.
Yeah. I one thing, like, on this stuff not resulting in violence, I don't know what your childhoods were like, but I remember being in a lot of fights when I was a kid. And I mean, it stopped at a certain age.
You are pretty disagreeable, Charles, so that doesn't surprise
No,
me.
I mean, yeah, actually, yeah. That was actually another thing I wanted to get into. Like, some people are more likely to get angry than others, or at least show the anger, not suppress it, right? And
Certainly.
what I was thinking is, like, if you look at the dimension, so every human is their own special snowflake, right? So I'm going to give some context around this before I get into it, just because I don't think it's obvious to everyone. Every human's their own special snowflake, but the way people vary seems to follow a pattern. And there are some researchers that have tried to understand this pattern, and they have an imperfect, incomplete way of understanding this, but this is the best they have right now. And this is what gets called the 5-factor model of the Big Five. And it divides up human differences in personality in 5 dimensions. And one of those dimensions is often called agreeableness. So at one end, you have people who are agreeable, and it seems to be caused by different things. Like, you could be very compassionate, or you could be very compassionate, or you could be very polite. Or on the other end, you have people who are very straightforward, frank, genuine, sincere, but also, like, they're so frank and honest that they might say something that'll offend you without realizing it.
I'm not sure that agreeableness is like equated with sincerity.
No. Low agreeableness is equated with sincerity.
Well, that's so sincere or insincere.
Yeah. So these people tend to be on the other end, like, very sincere, but also they tend to be competitive, right? And the competitiveness seems like it can be related to, like, a anti-dominance feeling. Like, they a lot of them don't like anyone trying to dominate them, anyone trying to, like, be their boss or put themselves above them, and it causes them to try, if they have the ability, to push past everyone, right? To try to, like, either improve themselves or putting themselves in better situations or getting out of situations where they'd have to subordinate, right? Those people, I could imagine, and I have nothing to, like, I don't have any data in front of me right now because I wasn't expecting to talk about this, but we do a lot of stuff without data, it seems, on this. So I'd suspect that some of those people are more likely to show the anger more. Although I'll just say this. So I do have one friend He's in kind of like the same general industry as I am. He, like a lot of the people who tend to get into the same field that I do, they tend to have like three characteristics. Like they tend to be very high in openness, very high in conscientiousness, but industrious style conscientiousness, not orderliness, and very low in agreeableness, right? And he's someone that doesn't fit that, right? He is very, very agreeable, very polite. He's not compassionate. He's very polite. But there's times where there's a kind of rage that comes out from him, but he never shows it. He shows it to like, just like people who knows well. So, I mean, he seems to have the rage. He just
But rage is different than anger.
He seems to have a kind of anger too. It's just, he keeps it inside. He'll just like talk about it with like small groups of people, like keep it so that, I think like, so that he can't become a target for a rebuttal or ridicule or affect his reputation, or that he even have to go into that kind of social conflict. Like someone would push back, right? Like that seems to really bother him. So among like trusted friends, he'll say something, but he won't say it in front of others.
So my quick research over the last 24 hours didn't actually find any research related to the Big Five, but I think that would be pretty interesting, right? Because I suspect that different traits are going to correspond more with propensity to anger. And I think it might be surprising to people. I think, like, for instance, I think people with high agreeableness might actually be prone to anger. It depends on the context in which they're in. I think this is a point that, not that we're Jordan Peterson fans here, we're not. But one thing I did find interesting, Peter, think about agreeableness as like the maternal feeling of looking after the cub. But if you try and get between the mother bear and her cub, then you can find out the dark side of agreeableness really fast, right? You know, and I think that's probably true of humans too. So I think that would be interesting research to do, to find out how the Big Five traits break down in terms of propensity.
There's another one I'd imagine relating to that, the emotional stability / neuroticism. Like, you know, if you're someone who's very like emotionally stable, so you're not neurotic, you're more likely to, you know, just be calm a lot, right? My suspicion is that if you're like, say, very emotionally stable but very low in agreeableness, you'll tend to be calm a lot. But if something like causes you to become angry, you'll show it.
Yeah. So I wanted to, if we can just shift direction just a little bit, I wanted to also emphasize or mention something else that I came across that I thought was quite interesting. So we already mentioned that Aaron Zell makes the point that though anger replicates the appearance of violence, that it apparently doesn't very often result in violence, or far less than you might think. So along that line, I found this really interesting little paper, and Charles won't be happy because they don't go into the methodology very thoroughly, but it's in the Current Directions in Psychological Science, and the paper is called The Role of Intergroup Emotions in Political Violence by Matsumoto, Frank, and Huang. But this is a pretty interesting paper. So what they did is they went back quite far. I think they even included Hitler. You always got to include Hitler, right? So they went back and looked at different situations where mass movements either did or did not result in violence. And what they did was they looked at the speeches of the leaders of these movements months leading up to the culmination of whatever this actually was. And they did what's called content analysis of the speeches, right? And this is where they don't provide enough methodological explanation. It's pretty elaborate stuff doing content analysis. So you have to actually work out what terms you're going to interpret as what is representing what, right? And then looking for the frequency or the context of these words, in this case, in these political speeches, right? But so what they determined was that in those situations where you have where social movement results in violence against some other group, you do have increased anger. But the increased anger also appears in those in the speeches of the leaders of those social movements that do not result in violence. So it doesn't appear as the increase in violence is the important difference in terms of what results in violence. What is important is that where you find language that suggests contempt or disgust, right? So you have to have the increase of anger to get violence from social movements, but in addition to that, you also have to have an increase in attitudes of contempt and disgust towards the group that the violence is eventually exercised upon. So I think that is pretty interesting stuff. I would like to see, like I said, this is a very short paper, no room to go into the methodology. I'd like to see more about how they did this, but that would seem to fall in line with what Sal was suggesting, and I think it falls in line with what we were talking before about the actual political anger that we're seeing in places like the States right now is not just anger, right? Is that people really do consider each other to be like contemptible, right? You know, like you know, racist and, you know, disgusting things, right? You know, that people call each other. So it's not enough that they're angry. There's really a kind of dehumanization that goes along with that anger that makes the violence credible.
Yeah, I mean, one cliche you often hear is how people on the left, how they in the U.S. how they describe Republicans, for example. You know, they're stupid, they're unethical, they're like
bag of
like,
deplorables.
yeah, it's a way of dehumanizing like people on the right, and I mean that's an instance of it, for example. But like it's not to say that the left is the only one that does that. People on the right, you know, they throw a lot of vitriol towards, you know, people on the left also. So it seems to go both ways, right?
Yeah, and there's this, you know, from the other side is this thing of I mean, first of all, there's, you know, the left defends, you know, welfare bums and the lazy people, and then this whole thing about immigrants. Then there's always kind of a virusy sort of thing around immigrants, that they're somehow infecting the political culture, you know, this kind of thing. Yeah, this sort of language goes both ways for sure. Yeah. And I think if you were to be worried about the potential of violence in those kind of political contexts, anger seems to be an important indicator, but also these other things, this increased tendency to treat the other side with contempt and with disgust, suggests that things could be going in a bad direction in the United States, and I think it's a very real possibility. And this the sort of the initial stuff that I've looked at around this research suggests that this is not an unfounded concern.
Yeah.
And of course, and another thing too that is also worth mentioning is that when we talked about the evolution of anger as a way of, you know, of getting people to recalibrate their attitude towards you, whether it's in the personal relationship or in a larger social context, the other thing, of course, is that when, you know, in the context, and this becomes sort of like a mismatch issue. And you know, for those who are not regular listeners, there's this idea that we've evolved certain tendencies that provided benefits to our ancestors in the past, but now in the modern world, maybe don't function the same way or aren't as effective. The famous example of this being sweet tooth. For our ancestors, it was a valuable adaptation because it motivated them to get access to rich carbohydrates that were otherwise dangerous and difficult to access. But now in the modern world, where we can get all the sweets we want, you know, the drop of a hat, it's not so adaptive anymore. So I think there's something similar to this going on with anger, is that it certainly worked effectively in that context. You can see how it would work effectively in that evolutionary context of our ancestors. But now we live in an environment living with, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And we don't have the sort of interpersonal face-to-face interaction with people that we're angry at, for the most part, right? And in fact, we tend to live in our little bubbles, and we're even segregating more and more people, you know, like especially in the States, you know, moving more and more to states or cities with, you know, where people sort of share their views. So you less and less come in contact with the people, you know, in real life who you disagree with. So, you know, rather in the original evolutionary context, you had to actually deal with people, both in the sense that they could get angry back at you, right? So, you know, there would be a tap down on your anger. And also there was the potential for empathy, right? It's just, you know, as angry as you get, you know, this is just another person. We all make mistakes, whatever. You know, there's sort of a humane or human element to it. But now we live in these little ideological bubbles, and the anger just escalates and escalates and escalates, and there's nothing to moderate it. There's no interaction to moderate it, and quite the contrary. In places like with social media, like on Twitter, other people cheer you on when you get angry. You know, people cheer you on, and the anger becomes sort of part of your membership card to belong to a certain kind of ideological club of some kind. So this is why I think the anger, whatever benefit it may have provided, and still does, and I'm not saying obviously at an interpersonal level it still works in the way that it was evolved to do, but now at a larger social level it doesn't seem to be functioning the same way, and seems to be driving us towards increasing social fragmentation rather than negotiating resolutions of those social problems.
Right.
I wonder if some of what causes people to say move to a neighborhood might also change their preferences, right? And like change their politics in a sense. Like for example, if you move to a more expensive neighborhood, it might be because you're doing better at life, and you might have very different interests than someone who, for example, is having trouble, paying any rent, having trouble like getting enough food and stuff like that. And that's your politics can also be affected by life circumstances.
Were you going to say, Patricia? No,
sorry. It's okay. Kind of. I don't remember where I was going to go with it.
Sorry.
Okay. So I don't know. I mean, like I think that there's real danger in the current situation. I acknowledge that it's easy to exaggerate that kind of thing. I wouldn't want to do that because I think that could be part of the problem. But I think it would be wrong to not acknowledge that there's real danger. And I use this example. I thought I would offer this example. I've used it before, and I'll use it again because I think it's really illustrative, and people should keep it in mind. Is that when I was in the 80s, when I was in graduate school, I would be reading journals, magazine articles that were celebrating Yugoslavia as the sort of the epitome of the multicultural society, and how this was what the future was going to be like, and we could all look forward to this, and we knew that a multicultural society could be an effective society because look at how fantastic it all worked in Yugoslavia. And of course, like 10 years later, these people were all murdering each other, committing genocide in farm fields against each other. And so this sort of thing can fall apart. You might think that you live in a secure civil society, but it can fall apart really, really fast. And it's just when I look at the political vitriol, the anger, and now prompted by this article to think in terms of also the importance of the contempt and disgust that we see in political discourse today, I think there's grounds to be actually quite concerned about the direction that things are going.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question. Have you seen any of this type of behavior within like around where we live in Canada?
Well, here's the irony, Charles. I pay very little attention to politics in Canada. Now, I do see it in Europe, though. There's definitely stuff in Europe, and some of the Brexit stuff has gotten out of hand. And though it's harder to access the European the continental countries if you don't speak their language, it's all secondhand rights, But there's certainly indications that certainly the worst. My impression is that the worst is in the States. I could be wrong about that.
Yeah. So my wondering was that, like, so when I get reports of the States, it's on YouTube, it's on Twitter, right? Same thing with Europe, right? But stuff that might happen in Canada, especially if it's in the Vancouver region, I have the potential to see this face to face. I have the potential to see like, is what I'm seeing like on Twitter or YouTube, is it just is this bullshit, or is it more real, right? And the thing is the stuff I've seen in Canada, I haven't really seen much go on. Like I've seen some of these protests, they're like barely anyone. There doesn't really seem to be an issue. And okay, there's stuff happening in the States. I haven't actually been to these personally, so I don't really have a sense of like, can I trust like what I see on YouTube?
Yeah, but I mean, I'm not sure we're talking about the same thing though, right? I'm not talking about news reports. I'm talking about people going online and talking, for instance, right? I'm talking about the discourse that people use. And it's quite clear that is the discourse they're using, right? It's not being misreported. We're seeing it live. This is the discourse that people are using on these kind of talk shows, right?
Okay, so it'd be like YouTube channels, for example.
For instance, yeah, this kind of thing, right? Or even the way people, the way people interact on Twitter, right? And not just anonymous accounts, like blue check accounts, and then, the sort of really aggressive, disgust and contempt-filled language that people use to discuss, on social media, like on Twitter. Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about.
I've been on the internet, I think, since the mid 1990s, and it's kind of changed. I mean, a lot of it was filled with people with very technical backgrounds like me, and like in the beginning. And you tend to get a certain personality that goes on there, and the way people interact with each other, the way people talk. I mean, you have people that tend to be high in openness, high in conscientiousness, low in agreeableness. So they're very straightforward, frank, honest, even to the point they might offend you, but they don't offend each other. That's the thing. And there was a lot of discussions, and there was disagreements and different preferences, but the conversation seemed to be very different. And as more and more people came on the internet, right? And this include coming onto Twitter, going on Facebook, especially YouTube. Like YouTube seems to bring in, it's more inclusive in that more people can interact with it rather than, you don't have to type, you don't have to read, just listen to a video. And but the nature of the conversation, this is what I think you're getting into, did seem to change. The tone seemed to change, right? And people having discussed responses. There's like one guy, like I used to read his blog more often, but he's on Twitter. I think his name is Robin Hanson, right? And a lot of the stuff he'd say, I thought were quite interesting, quite thought-provoking, but some people had real disgust responses to what he said. And I just found it bizarre, to be honest, because it's not something I would feel. But it seemed to be more representative of, let's say, like most people, like that kind of disgust response. And like, even when I see him on like saying stuff on his personal Twitter accounts now, I still see like some of these high disgust oriented people like popping into to comment to him, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just, it used to be that, you said something and I think you're wrong. Now it's like you said something and you can't say that, and that's disgusting to say that. That seems to be the common response now that we get from both sides.
Yeah, people, it's more people who moralize disgust, not just like, okay, or moralize even being offended, right? It's like, it seems like some people, like people who are like low in agreement, so people who are very straightforward, like you can offend them, doesn't matter. Right. I mean, it matters, but it doesn't really amount to anything. They get over it. Right. Like sticks and stones will break my bones. Names will ever hurt me type thing. But that's not everyone. And the internet's become much more inclusive. So you're getting different kind of personalities and people that are coming on board. And a lot of these people do have a problem with being offended, and do have a problem, and do like use disgust to manipulate others.
Yeah. And, and there's another dimension to this too, that we haven't talked about at all. Right. And it's that I'm quite certain that there's a lot of virtue signaling going on. People who are not angry, but pretend to be angry to get the benefits of being angry, and also to get the cred from their community from being angry, right? Because you're supposed to be angry now, right?
Yeah.
So, but the thing is, even if they're not really angry, it still contributes to the ratcheting up effect if you pretend to be angry. So it's just as much a part of the problem, even if it's not real, sincere anger.
I know some people who do this. I would say some of them are also trying to get women through this.
Yeah, well, everyone's trying to get a mate, Charles. This is men particularly trying to get women, right? But yeah. Patricia, you've been silent. Any put on this?
No, you guys. That's okay.
Okay. Well, I don't know. Think we've covered this? I think we've been on for close to an hour, right? Have we sort of knocked this one out of the park as usual?
I think so, probably.
Yeah, I think we covered it. All right. Okay then, guys. Well, that was fun. So this is I don't know what it is. Episode 17. We're building up there. So
But by the way, I like this new format with like all this on the screen. I think that's nice.
Yeah, I think this is good. So we'll have to go back and see, how much I froze. Regular watchers, and I know we have some regular viewers. Regular viewers will know that I'm constantly freezing and lagging. So hopefully this time less so. We'll how that goes.
Cool.
All right, guys. Well,
all right. It was nice. Thanks, guys.